Hello again. The 18th century was a pivotal period in European history. At long last, the Christian monopoly had been broken. The established churches were discredited by years of persecution and war. The Western mindset had been changed forever by scientific and philosophical ideas that seemed to be squeezing the supernatural out of the world. Christianity was retreating in the face of the Enlightenment. Yet these developments were also accompanied by the first stirrings of what was to become the modern pagan revival. Once the Christian monopoly had been broken, it was all but certain that a revival of paganism would get underway. The persistence of paganism in European culture, the prominence of the Greek and Roman classics in education, art and literature, made this practically inevitable. In the absence of Christian doctrinal restraints and physical repression, it was only a matter of time before people began to reanimate aspects of classical pagan religion. The 1790s saw the nearest thing to an organised attempt to revive pagan religiosity, when the French revolutionaries experimented with new religious cults to replace Catholicism. These cults were the product of mixed influences, but among them there was a pagan component. Take, for example, the Festival of Reason, which was celebrated in Paris in November 1793. Models of a temple and an altar were placed inside Notre Dame Cathedral, and, in answer to a musical prayer, a goddess-like figure representing liberty made a dramatic appearance. Similar celebrations were held all over France, in which local women played the roles of goddess-like figures. The Festival of Reason is just one example. Pagan language and symbols were used elsewhere by the revolutionaries too. There was something new stirring here, an attempted revival of pagan forms as a public alternative to Christianity for the first time since the end of the Roman Empire. The attempt failed, but there was nothing inevitable about that. Another attempt to create something that looked like a pagan movement was Freemasonry. Freemasonry first became fully established as a fraternal movement in the 18th century. While it was not a religion, it did look like one. The colourful, ritualistic, esoteric aspects of the Masonic lodges attracted and repelled many people precisely because they seemed like a rival religion to Christianity. For some writers, Masonry was comparable to the ancient solar cult known as Mithraism. The leading revolutionary, Tom Paine, thought that it was descended from Druid sun worship. Later on, in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII explicitly described it as an attempt to revive paganism. At this point, we can address one of the central historical questions of pagan studies. Who was the first open modern pagan? The answer seems to be that it was a teacher called John Frencham from Norwich in England, who lived from 1730 to 1810. Frencham was a strange man. He was given to unusual behaviour and morbid fears. He was something of a classical scholar, and one of the elements of his eccentric worldview was an attachment to Greco-Roman religion. His Antiqua Religio, a series of hymns to the gods, is the first explicitly pagan text penned by a European in modern times. It's interesting to speculate what would have happened if a pagan revival movement, inspired by Frencham, had taken root in 18th century British society. But it seems likely that his personal eccentricities held him back from founding a movement of this kind. Frencham was not the only pagan Englishman of his time. Another, better-known figure was the writer and philosopher Thomas Taylor. As with Frencham, Taylor embraced paganism under the influence of classical scholarship. Taylor was a devotee of the philosophical tradition of Plato and his successors. Starting from the 1780s, he published a stream of translations of Platonist texts, together with some scholarship of his own, It was said that Taylor engaged in devotional worship of the gods too, although the evidence on this is not as clear or strong as we would like. Other modern pagan revivalists have come to draw on his work in their own ritual worship. His translation of the Orphic hymns seems to be quite widely used for this purpose. Other pagan experimentations were also going on in 18th century Britain. There was the Druid revival, although the early Druids tended to be unorthodox Christians or monotheists rather than pagans. Then there was the circle of upper-class hellraisers around the politician Francis Dashwood, who enlivened their alcoholic orgies with pagan and Catholic symbolism. In 1771, Dashwood organised a pagan procession with hymns and music to dedicate a portico on his estate to Bacchus. The portico was modelled on the ancient temple of Bacchus at Teos. When his friend Paul Whitehead died in 1774, Dashwood had his heart ritually interred in a pagan ceremony. We might mention a couple of other eccentric upper-class Englishmen here too. The Gloucestershire landowner Benjamin Hyatt built a summer house called Pan's Lodge and organised processions in honour of the god. The classical scholar Richard Payne Knight argued that religion had originated in the worship of creative energy, symbolised by the sexual organs, and that this had survived from pagan times into modern folk Catholicism. He would later influence 20th century pagan revivalists, including Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner. The greatest impetus to the modern pagan revival came towards the end of the 18th century, with the birth of Romanticism. This cultural movement rejected the orderly world of the Enlightenment in favour of irrationalism and transgression. It celebrated the emotional, the old, the wild, and the taboo. Romantic experiments with pagan revival seem to have started in Germany. The writers Schiller, Goethe, and Hölderlin flirted with pagan revivalism. The early British Romantics formed part of the same trend. They had also read Thomas Taylor. In particular, there was a circle of British writers who knew and influenced each other personally. Percy and Mary Shelley, John Keats, Thomas Love Peacock, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, Leigh Hunt, and Edward Trelawney. These people's attachment to ancient paganism was open and explicit. They referred to themselves with the terms pagan, Bacchic, and Athenian. Percy Shelley, in particular, not only wrote and translated poems to classical deities, he also kept busts of them in his study and built altars to Pan. When he was drowned at the age of 29, his friends performed pagan funeral rites for him and another man who died with him. The form of paganism promoted by this circle of friends was characteristically romantic. It was a religion of joy, sensuality, and freedom. It could also have a radical political edge. It was a spiritual and moral antidote to the repressions of the Church of England and the Tory government, fashioned from the materials of the Greek and Roman classics that had been drilled into its practitioners when they were children. But at this point, we're moving out of the 18th century, and it's time to draw to a close. In the next video, we will be looking more closely at the 19th century, a crucial period for the modern pagan revival. If you want to learn more about the subject of pagan revivals, you may like to buy this book, which is out in October and currently open for pre-order. Paganism Persisting, from Exeter University Press, which I wrote with the historian Francis Young. It's available from the usual outlets.